In 1587, England was attempting something it had never successfully achieved before. It was trying to establish a permanent English settlement in the New World. Previous attempts had struggled. Some had failed completely. Yet the ambition remained. The settlement was organized under the authority of Sir Walter Raleigh. John White was appointed governor of the colony. Unlike earlier expeditions, this was not designed as a military outpost. It was intended to be a community. Families traveled together. Men, women, and children crossed the Atlantic with tools, supplies, and the intention of building something that would endure. The colonists did not originally intend to settle on Roanoke Island. Plans had pointed toward a different location along the Chesapeake Bay. However, circumstances forced them to remain at Roanoke instead. The reasons were logistical, political, and practical. Once there, they began rebuilding the settlement left behind from an earlier expedition. Roanoke Island was not empty land. It was part of a network of native communities with established territories, alliances, and rivalries. The English entered this landscape with limited understanding of those dynamics. They depended on fragile relationships and uncertain diplomacy. Despite this, construction began. Shelters were repaired. Defenses were reinforced. The colonists attempted to stabilize their presence in an unfamiliar environment. On August 18, 1587, a child was born in the colony. Her name was Virginia Dare. She was the first English child born in this settlement. Her birth was recorded carefully. It symbolized permanence, hope, and continuity. But permanence requires support. Supplies were limited. Food security was uncertain. Trade relationships were unstable. The colony depended on reinforcements and resupply from England. At some point, the colonists made a difficult decision. John White would return to England to secure additional provisions and support. He intended to return quickly. However, he left behind his daughter, his son-in-law, and his infant granddaughter. He also left behind over 100 settlers, whose survival depended on his return. The departure was meant to be temporary. It did not remain temporary. England soon became entangled in conflict with Spain. Ships were redirected for military purposes. Resources were reassigned. Travel across the Atlantic became complicated and delayed. White was unable to return as planned. Months became years. Back at Roanoke, the colony faced isolation. The historical record does not provide a detailed account of what occurred during those years. We know only what can be inferred. Supplies would have diminished. Seasonal pressures would have intensified. Relationships with local tribes would have evolved, whether cooperatively or otherwise. The colony remained beyond direct observation. Finally, in 1590, John White secured passage back to Roanoke. 3 years had passed since his departure. He approached the island expecting signs of life. Smoke rising from cooking fires, movement along the shoreline, some indication that the colony had endured. He found none. The settlement was deserted. There were no bodies. There were no visible signs of violence. The buildings were not reduced to ash. Instead, the structures appeared dismantled in an orderly manner. The palisade fortification had been taken down carefully. This did not resemble a massacre. It resembled departure. Then White noticed something carved into a tree. 3 letters. CRO. Elsewhere, carved into a wooden post within the fort, was a longer word. Croatoan. White understood the meaning immediately. Croatoan referred to both a native people and a nearby island, known today as Hatteras Island. Prior to his departure, it had been agreed that if the colonists relocated, they would leave a message indicating their destination. If they were forced to leave under distress, they were to include a specific symbol. White found no distress mark. He interpreted the carving as a direction rather than a warning. The logical conclusion was that the colonists had relocated to Croatoan. White attempted to investigate further. He planned to sail to Croatoan and search for evidence of the colony's survival. Weather intervened. A storm disrupted the voyage and forced the ship away from the coastline. The attempt to follow the carved message was abandoned. White returned to England without locating the colony, and that is where the primary record ends. A settlement of over 100 people vanished from documentation. No confirmed remains were found. No definitive record of their relocation exists. Only a word carved into wood. Croatoan. Was it a sign of survival? A negotiated relocation? Or the last clear direction before something else occurred? When John White left Roanoke in 1587, the colony was not stable. It existed, but it was fragile. The settlers had arrived later in the season than ideal. Crops require time, preparation, and familiarity with local conditions. The English colonists possessed agricultural knowledge suited to England, not necessarily to the coastal environment of present-day North Carolina. Food security would have been uncertain from the beginning. They were also rebuilding a settlement that carried history. An earlier English garrison had occupied Roanoke in 1585, and that attempt had collapsed amid conflict and scarcity. The memory of that failure lingered both for the English and for the native communities who had experienced its consequences. Trust, where it existed, was conditional. When White departed for England, he did so with the understanding that his absence would be brief. However, the colony could not operate indefinitely without outside support. Tools would wear down. Ammunition would diminish. Salt, grain, and other staples would become scarce. The delay in White's return was not a matter of weeks. It extended into years. From the colony's perspective, silence from England would not have felt temporary. It would have felt uncertain. 3 years is long enough for confidence to erode. During that time, the settlers would have faced several overlapping pressures. Environmental conditions along the Outer Banks were unpredictable. Storms could alter the coastline. Saltwater intrusion could damage crops. Fishing and hunting required local knowledge that the colonists may not have fully possessed. Beyond environmental challenges, there were political realities. The region surrounding Roanoke was not neutral ground. It was home to multiple native groups with their own alliances and rivalries. English presence affected those dynamics. Earlier tensions between English settlers and certain tribes had already led to violence. Some native groups had reason to distrust the English. Others may have seen strategic value in cooperation. If the colonists were struggling to sustain themselves independently, integration into a native community may have appeared practical rather than desperate. This brings us back to the word carved into wood. Croatoan was not a random term. The Croatoan people were known to the English. There had been prior contact and, at times, friendly interaction. Croatoan Island lay to the south, accessible by boat, and it offered a different network of relationships than Roanoke. If the colony made a calculated decision to relocate, Croatoan would have been a logical choice. Relocation, in this context, would not necessarily indicate collapse. It could represent adaptation. White had reportedly instructed the colonists that if they moved, they should carve the name of their destination. If the move was forced or occurred under duress, they were to include a cross or specific distress sign. White did not find such a mark. This detail has influenced interpretations for centuries. If the colonists left voluntarily, they would have had time to dismantle the settlement in an orderly manner. The careful removal of structures at Roanoke supports this possibility. The absence of burned buildings or scattered remains suggests that departure was planned rather than chaotic. However, voluntary relocation does not eliminate risk. Travel along the coast required seaworthy vessels. It required favorable weather. It required coordination among over 100 individuals, including children. It is possible that the colonists began the journey successfully. It is also possible that something occurred during or after that journey. The historical record provides no confirmation. Another factor to consider is internal leadership. With White absent, authority would have shifted within the colony. Decisions would have been made collectively or by appointed leaders. Those decisions would have been shaped by necessity rather than preference. If supplies dwindled beyond recovery, remaining at Roanoke would have meant gradual decline. Relocating toward Croatoan, where alliances may have offered trade or protection, would have increased their chances of survival. There is also archaeological evidence suggesting later European artifacts found on Hatteras Island. Some researchers have interpreted these as possible indications that members of the colony assimilated into native communities. However, such findings are limited and open to interpretation. The pressure to move was not theoretical. It was structural. An isolated settlement without resupply cannot remain static. It must adapt, expand, or dissolve. If the colonists chose to relocate, they did so under conditions shaped by uncertainty, environmental constraint, and political negotiation. The carved word, Croatoan, may represent their intended destination, but intention is not the outcome. Even if the colony reached Croatoan, their story would not necessarily continue in English records. Integration into native communities would have altered identity, documentation, and cultural continuity. To England, disappearance would look the same whether the colonists died or adapted. This is where the case shifts from absence to possibility. They may not have vanished in a single catastrophic event. They may have dissolved into another structure. The difference between disappearance and assimilation is not visible in the wood of a palisade. It is visible only in records that were never created. When John White finally returned to Roanoke in 1590, 3 years had passed since he had left the colony behind. 3 years is long enough for a settlement to either stabilize or disappear. As White's ship approached the coastline, he expected signs of life: smoke rising above the trees, movement near the shoreline, some signal that the colony had endured. There was nothing. The island appeared quiet. White and his crew made their way ashore cautiously. The approach itself was difficult. Sandbars, shifting currents, and unpredictable tides made landing hazardous. The coast had always been dangerous, but now it felt indifferent. When White reached the site of the settlement, he immediately recognized change. The buildings were gone, not destroyed in a violent manner, but dismantled. The fortification that once surrounded the colony had been taken down carefully. Timber appeared to have been removed intentionally rather than scattered by force. This detail mattered. It suggested organization. It suggested time. The colony had not been overrun in a sudden attack. If it had been, there would have been signs of struggle. Burned structures, debris, remains. White found none of these. Instead, he found absence arranged in order. Then he noticed the carvings. The first was partial, cut into a tree. 3 letters, CRO. It was unfinished, or possibly interrupted. The second carving appeared more deliberate. The word Croatoan was cut into a wooden post within the palisade. White understood its meaning immediately. Before his departure in 1587, there had been an agreement. If the colonists chose to relocate, they would carve the name of their destination. If they were forced to leave under distress, they would include a cross or specific mark to indicate danger. White searched for such a mark. He did not find one. This absence shaped his interpretation. The colonists, he concluded, had relocated voluntarily. Croatoan referred to both a people and an island located to the south, now known as Hatteras Island. The Croatoan tribe had maintained relatively amicable relations with the English in the past. If relocation had become necessary, moving toward Croatoan would have been logical. White did not hesitate. He resolved to sail to Croatoan and search for the colony there. However, timing intervened. Weather along the coast shifted rapidly. A storm began to form, and the ship's crew expressed concern about navigating the shoals and open waters in worsening conditions. Supplies were limited, and the captain faced the responsibility of preserving the ship and its men. The decision was made to leave. White protested, but authority over the vessel did not rest solely with him. The storm intensified. The opportunity to investigate Croatoan passed. White was forced to abandon the search and return to England. It was the last recorded attempt by a primary witness to locate the colony. From that point forward, the disappearance became a matter of inference rather than direct observation. White never saw his daughter again. He never saw his granddaughter. He never received confirmation of their fate. The carved word remained the only direct clue. Croatoan. It is important to consider the context of that moment. White stood within an abandoned settlement, structures removed, no signs of violence. A message left behind that appeared intentional, no distress mark, no immediate evidence of catastrophe. The most reasonable conclusion was relocation. Yet reason does not equal verification. White did not reach Croatoan. He did not confirm whether the colony arrived safely. He did not document what may have happened during or after their movement. His account ends at the shoreline, interrupted by weather. This interruption is central to the mystery. Had White reached Croatoan, the story might be different. The disappearance might have been recorded as migration rather than loss. The colony might have entered history through integration rather than absence. Instead, the search stopped at a carved word. The colony passed beyond direct English documentation, and once documentation ends, speculation begins. When John White left Roanoke for the final time in 1590, he carried uncertainty back across the Atlantic. But uncertainty is not the same as impossibility. If the colonists relocated to Croatoan, as the carved message suggested, then their story may not have ended at Roanoke Island. It may have continued beyond English documentation. This possibility shifts the narrative. Instead of asking how they died, we begin asking how they may have survived. The Croatoan people occupied what is now known as Hatteras Island. They were part of a broader network of Algonquian-speaking communities along the Carolina coast. The English had previously interacted with them, and by most surviving accounts, relations had been comparatively stable. In a survival context, alignment with a local tribe would have offered advantages: access to established food sources, knowledge of seasonal cycles, protection within an existing social structure. The English colonists, isolated and undersupplied, would have needed exactly those things. Assimilation, however, would not have been immediate or simple. Cultural differences were significant. Language barriers existed. Social structures differed. Yet necessity has a way of reshaping boundaries. If the colonists joined the Croatoan community, they may have gradually integrated. Children, especially, adapt quickly. Over time, English clothing, customs, and even names could have faded. What would remain would not necessarily resemble a colony. It would resemble absorption. There are historical references that complicate the disappearance narrative. In later years, English settlers reported encountering native individuals who claimed ancestry linked to the lost colony. Some accounts described people with lighter features or knowledge of English practices. However, these reports were anecdotal and often recorded decades after the disappearance. They are suggestive, not definitive. Archaeological findings on Hatteras Island have uncovered European artifacts from the late 16th century. Some researchers interpret these objects as potential evidence of interaction between the Roanoke colonists and local tribes. Yet trade between Europeans and native communities was not uncommon. Artifacts alone do not prove integration. They prove contact. Contact does not automatically confirm survival. Another possibility must be considered. Relocation may have begun successfully, but failed afterward. Travel along the Outer Banks required boats capable of navigating shallow waters and unpredictable currents. If the colonists attempted to move by sea, a single storm could have disrupted the journey. If they traveled inland, they would have entered unfamiliar territory where alliances were less certain. The carved word Croatoan may represent intention rather than destination. There is also the question of time. 3 years passed between White's departure and his return. That is enough time for multiple relocations. The colonists may have left Roanoke, reached Croatoan, and later moved again. Each move would further reduce the likelihood of leaving a trace. The English record ends because the English presence ended. From that point forward, the colony would exist only within native memory, if at all. This introduces a different kind of disappearance. Not violent, not immediate, gradual. Assimilation into another society would not register as a catastrophe in English archives. It would register as silence. And silence, in historical terms, often becomes a mystery. We must also consider the broader political landscape. The late 16th century was marked by shifting alliances among native groups. English presence altered local power dynamics. Aligning with a displaced colony might have offered strategic advantage to some tribes and risk to others. If the colonists integrated into one community, they may have been drawn into regional conflicts. Over time, identity can dissolve not only through adaptation, but also through absorption into larger social movements. The absence of confirmed remains does not confirm survival, but it does leave room for it. The Roanoke colony may not represent a sudden vanishing. It may represent the point at which documentation stopped tracking people who continued to live. The carved word remains central. Croatoan was not scratched in haste. It was carved deliberately. It suggests planning. It suggests direction. What it does not guarantee is an outcome. Assimilation offers one explanation, but it is not the only one. When historians revisit the Roanoke disappearance, they do not begin with mythology. They begin with conditions. And the conditions in the late 1580s were not stable. Tree ring studies conducted centuries later suggest that the region experienced a significant drought between 1587 and 1589. This period is now considered one of the most severe droughts in the area in several centuries. If accurate, this changes the landscape entirely. Drought does not simply reduce crops. It destabilizes food networks. It increases competition between communities. It transforms negotiation into urgency. A colony already dependent on uncertain supplies would have been vulnerable. Native communities, facing their own shortages, may have been less able or willing to provide assistance. Trade becomes difficult when resources are scarce. Under those circumstances, tension increases. Earlier English expeditions to Roanoke had already created friction. In 1585, a prior English garrison had clashed violently with local tribes. Trust had been damaged. Although some alliances were later rebuilt, relationships remained fragile. If drought intensified competition for food and territory, the presence of over 100 foreign settlers could have become unsustainable. In that context, relocation would not merely be practical, it would be necessary. But necessity does not always guarantee safety. One theory proposes that the colonists attempted to move inland toward more fertile areas along the Chesapeake Bay as originally planned. That region may have offered better agricultural conditions. However, moving inland would have required navigating through territories controlled by other tribes. Conflict could have occurred during such a movement. If violence took place away from Roanoke Island, the original settlement would remain intact, as White found it. The absence of destruction at Roanoke does not eliminate the possibility of conflict elsewhere. There are also accounts, recorded years later, suggesting that hostile tribes may have attacked English settlers in the region. Some historians reference statements made by Powhatan leaders during the early 1600s, claiming responsibility for eliminating a group of English settlers prior to the founding of Jamestown. These accounts are difficult to verify. They may reflect political strategy, intimidation, or historical memory altered over time. Still, they cannot be dismissed entirely. If the colonists relocated into contested territory, they may have encountered hostility. Environmental disaster must also be considered. The Outer Banks are not static. Storms reshape shorelines. Barrier islands shift. Inlets open and close. A hurricane striking the region could have devastated a relocated community, especially if they had settled in a more exposed area. Such an event might leave little archaeological evidence, particularly if it occurred centuries ago along a dynamic coastline. Yet, no confirmed mass grave has ever been found. No site definitively identified as the colony's final position has yielded conclusive proof of destruction. This absence of physical confirmation complicates the collapse theory. There is also the possibility of fragmentation. Rather than relocating as a single group, the colony may have divided. Some settlers could have joined Croatoan. Others may have attempted to move inland. Smaller groups might have dispersed into different communities. Fragmentation increases survival probability in some contexts. It also increases the difficulty of historical recovery. A divided colony would leave divided traces. Over time, those traces become indistinguishable from surrounding populations. When examining the collapse theories, one pattern emerges. Each explanation depends on factors that leave limited evidence. Drought leaves tree rings, not diaries. Conflict leaves oral accounts, not preserved documents. Storms reshape coastlines and erase foundations. What remains constant is the carved word. Croatoan suggests direction, but it does not eliminate danger. The colonists may have intended to reach Croatoan and encountered disaster en route. They may have reached it and faced new pressures there. They may have survived for years before being absorbed or eliminated. The historical record provides possibility, not certainty. And certainty is what transforms disappearance into history. Without it, we remain in interpretation. When written records fail, historians turn to the ground. The disappearance of the Roanoke colony has inspired centuries of speculation, but in modern times the search has shifted from narrative to excavation. If the colonists relocated, integrated, or perished elsewhere, the land itself might preserve evidence, not names and not explanations, but objects. Roanoke Island has been excavated multiple times. Archaeologists have searched for structural remains, personal belongings, and any trace that might clarify what occurred between 1587 and 1590. What they have uncovered is limited but not insignificant. Fragments of pottery have been found. Metal tools have been recovered. Evidence of English construction confirms that the settlement once stood where records place it. However, these findings do not explain what happened after John White's departure. Importantly, archaeologists have not identified destruction layers consistent with a violent attack at Roanoke itself. There are no widespread burn marks, no confirmed mass graves, and no structural evidence of catastrophic collapse. The condition of the site supports the idea that the colonists departed in an orderly manner rather than being eliminated in place. Because of this, attention has expanded beyond Roanoke Island. Hatteras Island, historically associated with the Croatoan people, has become a focal point for investigation. Excavations there have uncovered European artifacts dating to the late 16th century. Items such as gun parts, metal implements, and ceramics have been found in contexts connected to native communities. These discoveries are significant because they demonstrate contact. They suggest exchange, proximity, and interaction between English settlers and local tribes. However, contact does not automatically confirm assimilation. European goods circulated through trade networks along the coast, and artifacts alone cannot prove that the Roanoke colonists permanently relocated there. Objects travel more easily than people. Another area of interest lies inland along the Albemarle Sound, at a location sometimes referred to as Site X. Researchers have identified 16th century English artifacts in this region as well. Some historians interpret these findings as possible evidence that a portion of the colony attempted to relocate toward the Chesapeake Bay, which had been the expedition's original destination. If the colony divided into smaller groups, leaving traces in different locations, the archaeological record would reflect that fragmentation. Scattered evidence, however, is difficult to assemble into certainty. A divided colony would leave divided remains, and those remains may blend into broader historical layers. Archaeology also operates under environmental constraints. The Outer Banks are not static landscapes. Barrier islands shift, coastlines erode, storms reshape inlets and bury foundations. What existed in 1590 may no longer occupy the same position today. Even if the colonists constructed new dwellings after leaving Roanoke, those structures may have been temporary. Temporary settlements leave minimal archaeological signatures. Wood decays, organic materials vanish. What survives is often metal or ceramic, and even those materials can be displaced. Cultural integration complicates the picture further. If members of the colony joined native communities, their artifacts would gradually merge with local material culture. English metal tools could have been repurposed. Clothing would deteriorate. Architectural styles would shift. Within a generation, visible distinctions might disappear entirely. Archaeological layers document activity, but they do not always document identity. They record that something happened, not necessarily who experienced it. Some researchers have examined maps drawn by John White, noting faint markings that suggest alternate settlement locations. These markings have prompted renewed searches in recent decades. However, no excavation has yet produced conclusive proof of a relocated English colony directly linked to the settlers of 1587. The scale of the colony must also be considered. Just over 100 individuals left England for Roanoke. Even if they survived and integrated elsewhere, they would represent a small presence within a much larger indigenous population. Over time, cultural absorption would reduce their distinctiveness. 4 centuries of environmental change, human development, and natural erosion further complicate the investigation. The absence of conclusive archaeological evidence does not confirm extinction. It simply limits reconstruction. What the ground preserves is partial. Metal fragments, ceramic shards, soil disturbances. These pieces form patterns, but they do not create complete narratives. Archaeology has narrowed the range of possibilities. It has not eliminated them. No confirmed massacre site has been uncovered. No intact relocated settlement has been definitively identified. The evidence supports movement and contact. It does not confirm the final outcome. The Roanoke colony remains a case in which the Earth provides suggestion rather than resolution. The findings point toward adaptation and interaction, but they stop short of certainty. The disappearance of the Roanoke colony did not remain a quiet historical gap. Over time, it changed. At first, it was understood as a logistical failure. A governor departed for supplies. His return was delayed. When he finally came back, the settlement was empty. A carved word suggested relocation. Within official accounts, the case existed as a problem of timing, resources, and uncertainty. However, as years passed, the absence began to take on a different shape. When documentation ends without resolution, interpretation begins. In the early 17th century, English settlers established Jamestown. They carried with them knowledge of Roanoke's disappearance. The Lost Colony served as a warning about isolation, supply shortages, and fragile alliances. It was not yet a legend, it was a caution. Over time, however, the practical lesson faded. What endured was the mystery. The carved word, Croatoan, became more than a directional marker. It became symbolic. It represented the final trace of a community that vanished from record. As decades turned into centuries, the story gradually detached from its original context. The drought conditions, the political pressures, the supply limitations, and the logistical delays became secondary to a simpler narrative. An entire colony disappeared. No confirmed remains were found. Only one word was left behind. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Roanoke disappearance had entered the realm of folklore. Writers and historians began to interpret the case through increasingly dramatic lenses. Some accounts emphasized violent conflict. Others suggested mysterious forces. The uncertainty allowed for expansion. The absence of physical evidence created space for imagination. Without bodies or confirmed destruction, possibilities multiplied. The colony may have been massacred. It may have been absorbed completely. It may have perished during relocation. It may have transformed into something unrecognizable. Each generation shaped the narrative according to its own concerns. During the 19th century, as American identity developed, the Roanoke story took on symbolic meaning. Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the colony, became a cultural figure. Her name appeared in literature and historical retellings. The disappearance was reframed not simply as failure, but as a lost beginning. The human dimension deepened the mystery. The carved word gained emotional weight. Croatoan was no longer merely an instruction. It became a riddle. Some writers speculated that it concealed hidden meaning. Others suggested that the message implied something more deliberate than relocation. Yet when examined within its historical context, the carving aligns with an agreed plan to indicate destination. The absence of a distress symbol suggests that the colonists did not intend to signal catastrophe. Still, legend thrives on ambiguity. In modern times, The Roanoke story has expanded further through popular culture. Television programs, novels, and speculative documentaries have reframed the disappearance as an unsolved enigma. Some interpretations remain grounded in historical uncertainty. Others move beyond evidence entirely. Supernatural explanations have appeared. Stories of curses, unexplained forces, and even otherworldly intervention have circulated. These interpretations reflect imagination rather than documentation, but they persist because the historical gap remains unfilled. Mystery invites embellishment. The endurance of the Roanoke disappearance is not accidental. It survives because it rests at the boundary between record and silence. There is enough documentation to confirm that the colony existed. There is enough absence to prevent confirmation of its fate. That combination sustains interest across centuries. Legends grow when records stop. The longer a case remains unresolved, the more it absorbs interpretation. Over 400 years, Roanoke has been reshaped repeatedly. It has moved from colonial failure to cultural myth, from logistical uncertainty to national symbol. Yet beneath these layers, the structural facts remain unchanged. A settlement was established in 1587. John White departed for supplies. He returned in 1590 to find it empty. The word Croatoan was carved into wood. He was unable to pursue the clue. The colony disappeared from English documentation. What changed over time was not the evidence itself, but the meaning assigned to it. Folklore fills emotional space. History fills structural space. Roanoke occupies both. When we remove the layers of legend and speculation, the Roanoke case becomes more structured. It shifts from myth to documented sequence. A colony was established in 1587. It consisted of approximately 115 settlers, including men, women, and children. John White departed for England to secure supplies. His return was delayed for 3 years. When he arrived in 1590, the settlement was deserted. The word Croatoan had been carved into wood. No distress symbol was found. No bodies were discovered. These elements are historically supported. Everything beyond them exists within interpretation. The first stable conclusion is that the colony did not vanish suddenly at Roanoke Island. The careful dismantling of buildings suggests planning rather than panic. Timber appears to have been removed deliberately, not destroyed in violence. There were no confirmed signs of massacre, such as burned structures or mass graves. This indicates time and organization. The settlers had the opportunity to make a decision. The second stable conclusion is that relocation was anticipated. Before White departed, the colonists had agreed to carve their destination if they moved. If forced to leave under duress, they were to include a distress mark. White found no such mark. The presence of Croatoan aligns with this instruction. The absence of a distress symbol suggests that the move, at least initially, was not intended to signal catastrophe. However, intention does not guarantee survival. The third stable conclusion is that 3 years without resupply would have forced adaptation. No small settlement could remain stable indefinitely under such conditions. Food supplies would have diminished, tools would have worn down, political tensions would have evolved. Environmental pressures, including documented drought conditions during that period, would have intensified scarcity. Remaining at Roanoke without reinforcement would have been unsustainable. Relocation was not only possible, it was likely necessary. What remains uncertain is scale. Did the entire colony relocate together, or did smaller groups separate? Fragmentation increases survival chances in some contexts, but it also complicates historical reconstruction. A divided colony would leave divided traces. What remains uncertain is duration. If the settlers integrated into native communities, how long did they remain culturally distinct? A generation may be sufficient for identity to shift. Language, clothing, and customs adapt quickly, particularly among children. Assimilation leaves a limited archival record. What remains uncertain is location. Archaeological investigations on Hatteras Island and inland sites have uncovered 16th-century European artifacts. These findings demonstrate contact between English settlers and native populations. However, artifacts alone do not confirm that the Roanoke colonists established a permanent settlement at those locations. Objects circulate through trade. Identity does not travel as clearly as metal. Environmental change further complicates recovery. The Outer Banks are dynamic landscapes. Barrier islands shift. Coastlines erode. Storms alter topography. Over 4 centuries, natural processes and human development have transformed the region. Evidence that may once have existed could now lie submerged, buried, or eroded. When viewed structurally, the most plausible explanation combines relocation with adaptation. The colonists likely left Roanoke intentionally and moved toward Croatoan or other inland areas. What occurred afterward remains beyond definitive verification. The absence of massacre evidence, combined with archaeological signs of interaction, supports the possibility that at least some settlers survived beyond the departure. Yet survival without English documentation becomes indistinguishable from disappearance within English history. There is an important distinction to make. Roanoke is not an event that defies logic. It is not a supernatural absence. It is a historical gap created by delayed return, environmental pressure, and incomplete record-keeping. The system designed to document expansion ended before the outcome could be recorded. That is the core of the mystery. Roanoke persists because it sits at the boundary of certainty. Enough evidence exists to construct probability. Not enough exists to establish finality. The carved word remains, but the story behind it does not. More than 4 centuries have passed since the Roanoke colony disappeared from the English record. During that time, empires have risen and fallen, borders have shifted, and entire cities have emerged where wilderness once stood. Yet the word, carved into wood in 1590, continues to resonate. Croatoan. The endurance of this case is not accidental. It persists because it occupies a precise intersection between ambition and uncertainty. It marks a moment when expansion moved faster than infrastructure, and when documentation failed to capture the outcome. Disappearance carries a unique power. When a community collapses through war, famine, or fire, evidence remains. Ruins stand as confirmation. Written accounts describe the event. Even tragedy can be closed by record. Roanoke offers no such closure. There were no confirmed bodies. There was no verified site of destruction. There was no final letter explaining departure. There was only an empty settlement and a carved word indicating direction. Absence creates space, and space invites interpretation. Roanoke also endures because it represents an early threshold in colonial history. It was one of England's first serious attempts to establish a permanent presence in North America. Had it succeeded, it might be remembered as a foundational settlement. Instead, it became a lesson in vulnerability. The Lost Colony demonstrates that expansion was never inevitable. It required sustained supply lines, political negotiation, environmental adaptation, and reliable communication. Roanoke lacked at least one of these elements, and possibly several. Its disappearance reflects the fragility of early colonial systems. The carved word continues to hold power because it feels unfinished. It suggests continuation without confirmation. It implies movement without visible arrival. It offers direction without revealing the destination. Had the settlement been discovered in ruins, the narrative would be tragic but contained. If a definitive record of relocation had been found, the case would be resolved. Instead, the colony stepped beyond documentation. That step transformed a historical event into an enduring mystery. The human dimension deepens this effect. Virginia Dare, born in 1587, symbolizes the colony's promise. Her presence personalizes the disappearance. When we consider that families, children, and entire households vanished from record, the event becomes more than a logistical failure. It becomes intimate. The central question shifts from what happened to a settlement to what happened to individuals. Did they survive by integrating into neighboring communities? Did they relocate and gradually lose their distinct identity? Did environmental or political pressures eliminate them in ways that left no recoverable trace? The inability to answer these questions sustains interest across generations. Roanoke also exposes the limits of systems. The English crown attempted expansion through structure and documentation. Governors were appointed, instructions were given, and agreements were established. Yet a 3-year delay severed the chain of oversight. Once John White failed to return as expected, the colony moved beyond England's capacity to monitor it. From that moment forward, whatever occurred happened outside the system designed to record it. The disappearance reveals how distance, weather, and political conflict could disrupt even carefully planned ventures. The power of Croatoan lies in its incompleteness. It is not a farewell. It is not a confession. It is not a warning. It is a marker. It represents the final confirmed action taken by the colony. After that, the record falls silent. Roanoke endures because it sits at the boundary between probability and proof. Historians can construct plausible explanations, but none can be confirmed with final certainty. The evidence supports relocation and adaptation, yet it stops short of resolution. That boundary keeps the case alive. The Roanoke colony did not disappear in darkness. It disappeared in the daylight. There was no confirmed battlefield, no documented mass grave, and no final letter explaining what occurred. Instead, there was an empty settlement and a single word carved into wood: Croatoan. When historians reconstruct this case, they begin with what can be confirmed. A colony was established in 1587. John White departed for England. His return was delayed for 3 years. When he came back in 1590, the settlement was deserted. The word Croatoan had been carved into a tree and a post. No distress symbol was present. No bodies were found. These facts remain stable. Everything beyond them exists within probability. The most plausible explanation is neither dramatic nor supernatural. The colony likely relocated. Environmental pressure, limited supplies, and fragile political relationships would have made long-term survival at Roanoke increasingly difficult. The prior agreement to carve a destination supports the idea of an intentional move. The absence of a distress mark suggests that the departure was not initially framed as an emergency. What followed cannot be confirmed. The settlers may have reached Croatoan and integrated into the local community. They may have divided into smaller groups, seeking stability inland. They may have survived long enough for their identity to merge with surrounding populations. It is also possible that environmental hardship or political conflict altered their fate after relocation. Each of these scenarios remains structurally possible. None can be proven with final certainty. Roanoke is not enduring because it defies logic. It endures because it resists confirmation. There is a distinction between events that cannot be explained and events that cannot be verified. Roanoke belongs to the latter category. The disappearance did not occur outside reason. It occurred outside of documentation. Once the continuity of record-keeping was broken, whatever followed ceased to exist within English history. Survival, adaptation, or collapse may have occurred, but without confirmation, each possibility remains incomplete. Silence replaced structure. This pattern is not unique to Roanoke. A system is established to monitor expansion. Distance interrupts communication. Time widens the gap. An event occurs beyond oversight. The record ends. When records end, interpretation begins. The carved word remains powerful because it marks that boundary. It is not a farewell, and it is not an explanation. It is a marker left by people who expected someone to follow it. The follow-up never occurred. The weather intervened. Timing intervened. Authority shifted. The opportunity passed. And with it, certainty. 4 centuries later, we return not because we expect new answers to emerge from the wood, but because the question remains intact. What happened after the carving? Did the colony survive by transforming? Did it fragment and disperse? Or did it face forces that left no trace recoverable today? The record does not say. It preserves the moment before resolution. Roanoke ultimately teaches something precise about history. Documentation creates continuity. Continuity creates certainty. When continuity breaks, history becomes probability. The colony did not vanish into nothing. It moved beyond the archive. And, beyond the archive, survival and disappearance can appear identical. Before we close this case, look at the time on your clock, then tell me where you are watching from. Cases like this persist because they exist between what was written and what was never recorded. When placed side by side, those gaps form patterns. If you have encountered a record, a location, or a story that seemed incomplete, leave it in the comments. Some investigations begin exactly that way. And if you want to continue exploring cases where documentation ends, but the question does not, subscribe to The Lurking Archive. There are still settlements that have stepped beyond the record, still stories that dissolved into silence, still words carved into wood, waiting to be understood.